I'm Christine Roman.
And I'm Jonathan Graves. This is Pediatric VIEW Perspectives.
Today, I think we'll talk a little bit about the framework that we use here at Pediatric VIEW to evaluate children. It's important to kind of define children in terms of their own level of functional vision, correct? So we frame that in a test called the CVI Range. When did you start using the CVI Range, Jonathan? Do you remember?
I do remember distinctly, and I want to back up and start by saying I'm a teacher of the visually impaired by training, and when I started working with children with visual impairments and blindness, my mode of assessment and considering the impact of vision was a functional vision evaluation. And this is a series of activities and observations that is designed to look at the impact of a child's ocular visual impairment on their learning. Mm-hmm. When I started, I knew children who had CVI during this time. I knew children who had been diagnosed with CVI at this time, but I didn't understand the vast difference in the way they were using their vision that I couldn't capture using a functional vision assessment.
I had a very similar experience, actually. As a young teacher of the visually impaired, I would work in some centers where I had children on my caseload who had eye disorders. And I felt pretty comfortable knowing how to help give them access to things.
Right.
But then I remember one day a teacher said to me, Christine Roman, you're working with this child who has glaucoma. What about this child who just stares at the lights all day?
Right.
And I thought, yeah, what about that child? And I would look through her, I remember exactly what her name is, look through her medical records, and there was nothing that would indicate she qualified for my caseload. Well, what I was seeing way back then were those children who had CVI. Yeah. So we did the best we could, right? We did what we thought was right, but it probably resulted in kind of not real effective results, right?
That's true. That's true.
How did that feel for you as a teacher of the visually impaired, knowing in your gut, like, I'm not really on the right path here?
I think it was easy to explain away that, and I think I see this now when I talk to school districts and I learn about children who are being served in schools, where it's easy to think, well, that behavior that we're seeing, that's a cognitive impairment. This child isn't ready for this kind of work. Yeah, or that child prefers those things because that's what they like to look at. And they don't prefer these other activities because that's not those aren't the toys that they're into. I think when I started using the CVI range and I started to realize the impact that color had, that movement had, that visual complexity had, that latency had, those changes, that changed how I started to present materials. And the aha moment for me was when I realized if I change the way I think about this presentation and I change my assessment process, I can help this child show me skills that not only have I not seen with them, but in many cases, and this was the profound thing for me, their families had never seen before. I think the most impactful moment for me was being with families who said, you are helping my child do something that I have never seen them do in their life.
Yes, it's a very special opportunity. It's an honor. It's something that makes a big difference. And I too felt frustrated. And the CVI range was born. This is the functional vision assessment that is really designed for children who have brain-based visual impairment, or CVI. And it turns out the way we assess children with eye disorders is really different than those who have brain-based or cortical visual impairment. And so I too felt finally like I was sort of on a path that could actually meet this child where they were. The CVI range is a test of functional vision, and it is designed to look at children on a continuum where the degree of functional vision that they have is determined on a 0 to 10 continuum, where 0 is little or no functional vision and 10 is near typical. We really don't see scores of 0 and we don't see scores of 10 because that would be no vision or normal vision. But the key is to find where they are in between there. So we derive a score from this test, but we also break it down into some broad sections, some broad definitions that are called the phases.
Right.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about the 3 phases?
Right. So the phases are just numbered 1 and 2 and 3. Phase 1 is a child who scores from a 0 or above a 0 to a 3 on the range. And in that phase, a child is really working to develop their visual function. They're really learning to use their vision and probably haven't had that access prior. So,
and don't you think those children actually appear as though they're non-visual most of the time?
They do.
Most of the time.
These children may not look at their parents' faces. They may not have favorite toys. They may stare at lights, or they may stare at surfaces that don't appear to be visually interesting.
Right. So these are children who are really just struggling to kind of get launched. What about phase 2? I really think phase 2, which is above 3 to 7 on that continuum, almost could be broken into early and later phase 2,
right.
Because what happens in phase 2?
So many things happen in phase 2,
So
and that's why I think we want to split it a little bit more. But in phase 2, children are they are using their vision more reliably in a broader array of environments and circumstances. They still need a great deal of support to facilitate that vision, but the big things that are happening are that children realize that they can interact with the world and that they can affect what they're seeing.
Yeah.
So we see a lot of vision-directed action in phase 2.
Yeah.
We're encouraging the child to notice what's around them, recognize the things that are familiar, and interact with them for all kinds of purposes.
Right. So a child in phase 2 kind of goes from somewhere in phase 2 from learning to see to then seeing to learn, using their vision to apply it. So then very briefly in phase 3, what happens there? If that's a score above 7, to
Right.
as high as you can get.
Right.
Yes.
Right. In phase 3, we see that in some cases, some of the characteristics may sort of fade into the background and not be as important, although I think all the characteristics continue to be important even in phase 3. But at
Just
this
a
point,
little more subtle.
They're more subtle.
They're more subtle.
Yeah, they are. We see that children, their vision is really on almost all the time. They are using vision as a primary mode of accessing the world around them in their curriculum. And the goal there is really to refine that use of vision for the kinds of specialized tasks, visual tasks, that we would expect to see in the classroom. So literacy takes a huge push in phase 3. We see a lot of refinement of understanding images, being able to process different kinds of images and relate them to objects in the real world.
Right. So in phase 3, the child still has CVI. The characteristics are still quite impactful. The child actually experiences, vision on all day, but now also has visual fatigue and still requires lots and lots of support. In fact, maybe even more support than a child in phase 1. So that's go ahead, Jonathan.
Because they're using their vision for more kinds of tasks across a broader amount of time.
Right.
And the expectation that they have is to be visually accessing more things in class.
So that's a brief overview of the framework that we use at Pediatric VIEW to assess and to start the very beginnings of planning for those specialized materials and adaptations and environments. Thank you.
Take care.